Hey, greetings everyone from our home to yours. I hope that this finds you safe and well. I apologize for missing last Sunday. We were in the middle of some transition and not able to make a video or a podcast. And so I apologize for that. Thank you for your patience and understanding. So welcome to another episode of the stories that Jesus told, the lessons that Jesus taught, and the things that Jesus said. We are going to look at Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 50. And it says, while he was still speaking with the crowd, his mother and brothers were standing outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. He replied to the one who was speaking to him and said, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So Jesus is speaking to a group of teachers of the law and some Pharisees that had asked him to do some miracles in order to prove that he was who he says he was. And he starts to explain to them that they were truly a wicked and adulterous generation for asking him to show them miracles to prove who he was. He says some pretty bad things about him, and then he tells them that you are in fact going to see a sign, and that sign was going to be the sign of Jonah, which we know today as him being in the tomb for 3 days and then coming out being resurrected. But while Jesus was speaking with his mothers and brothers outside, they came and asked to speak to him. And it's interesting to me, one, that they were outside, and two, that they had to ask to speak to Jesus. I would have thought that they would have been able to have full access to Jesus whenever they needed. And I also wonder what was so important and urgent that they felt the need to interrupt his sermon, if you will. But anyway, the messenger says to him, hey, Jesus, your mother and your brother are outside. They're waiting on you. And he says, well, who are my mother and brothers? And Jesus then points to his disciples and says, these are my mother and brothers. And anyone who does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. And I think that this passage doesn't get talked about enough. And I believe that Jesus is setting a paradigm in this lesson, in this sermon, if you will, that we really, as humans and Christians, don't really want to address. And I think that says more about how big God is and how small we humans in our thought, our theologies, and our actions are. And there's just a couple of things that I think that are really profound in this statement. And the first is how inclusive it is, meaning anyone who does the will of God is family. But the other thing that's very profound about this statement is how exclusive it is, in that it says it's anyone, meaning those who do the will of God are family. There are no labels. There's no gender, race, education, denomination, belief, doctrine, theology, background, financial status. There's no exclusions. There's no labels. It's if you do God's will, you are family, period. But on the other side of the coin, it's not if you preach or lead worship or teach at seminary, pastor a church, do podcasts, teach at Sunday school, or whatever it is. If you do God's will, you are family, period. Meaning that none of those things make you God's family unless they are truly God's will for you. Well, the question could be, are you doing God's will? Well, then the answer is yes. If you are doing God's will, then you're family. So we can stop all the division and all the mess and all the harm that we're causing by these divisions and by these stipulations and by these doctrines and theologies that are anything but if you do God's will, you are family. It doesn't matter how you were baptized. If you do God's will, you're family. It doesn't matter if you speak in tongues. If you do God's will, you're family. Now, all of you that are pro sprinkle or immersion or pro speaking in tongue are going to argue that it's God's will for you to speak in tongues, be sprinkled or baptized, or whatever doctrine that you like, whatever it is, you are going to argue that it's God's will. So what is God's will? Is it church membership, tithing, and serving? Well, it may be God's will or part of it, but the Lord has told us what is good, meaning he's told us what his will is. And that is, the Lord has told us what is good. So he has told us what his will is. And this is what he requires of us: to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God, or your God is what Micah 6:8 says. I think that's the standard we should all live by. Do what is right, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. So may you go this week and do God's will, my brothers and sisters. Grace and peace to you. God bless you.